Welcome to How Do We Move Forward? Navigating Life After the Pandemic. Accomplished UCLA experts will be discussing how our world has altered because of the COVID-19 epidemic and the long-term impact the pandemic will have on different aspects of our lives and in various sectors. I am Susan Rice, President of Women in Philanthropy. Women in Philanthropy at UCLA celebrates and inspires women's giving across the UCLA campus. Within and without, we foster women's participation in volunteer leadership positions, giving to UCLA of our time, talent, and treasure. Our diverse membership gives all over UCLA. Since its beginning, our extraordinary women leaders have served UCLA on departmental advisory councils, task forces, student mentoring, scholarships advisories, the University of California Board of Regents, and the UCLA Foundation Board of Trustees. In 2019, we celebrated our 25th anniversary. And I'm proud to say that at the beginning of this year, we are now over 3,000 women members strong. Yes. To engage the UCLA community, we hold events throughout the year that showcase different topics and different areas of the UCLA campus. Since COVID-19 hit our world, Women in Philanthropy has provided all of our events in a virtual format. This is our first large-scale in-person event in over 2.5 years, and our first time in using the hybrid format of both in-person and virtual over Zoom. So we ask that you please be forgiving and patient with us if there are any glitches. That being said, we've been really delighted at the enormous and enthusiastic response that our virtual presentations received. And it's brought us closer to our members who live in Northern California, outside of the West Side, and all of the states in our country beyond. For those of you in the room, you can find out more information about Women in Philanthropy on your seat. And this is what the program looks like, our new brochure. This event has been an exciting opportunity for us to reach out across campus and bring together experienced faculty from different departments to share information on tonight's topic. After the pandemic, which is the topic, sorry, with setbacks, we return to normal life. And what's it look like, and how are we going to adjust, and will we ever be able to return to normal? Our panel, leading UCLA professionals in different fields, will discuss how our world has altered. And will we ever go back? So we'll have time for Q&A afterwards, both from you in the audience and for those joining us via Zoom. Before I introduce the panel, I would like to know if you would raise your hand if this is the first time you've been on campus in a year. Good, we have a few people. And is there anyone who has been, this is the first time they've been in the Luskin Center? No, everybody's been here before, so it was easy to find the location. And those of you on Zoom, I hope you'll join us in person next time. So anyway, here are our panel. First on my left, and then we're going across from left. Let's see, it's your right, my left, but you're first, Dr. Timothy Brewer. And Timothy Brewer is professor in the Division of Infectious Diseases at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA, and a professor of epidemiology at the UCLA Fielding School of Public Health. And next to Tim is Bridget Callahan, who's assistant professor, Department of Psychology, and the director of the Brain and Body Lab. And next to Bridget is Anna Marie Francois, director of Center X at the School of Education and Information Studies. And next is Eric Johnson, faculty director at the UCLA Anderson Center for Management of Enterprise in Media, Entertainment, and Sports. Is that MEMS? Memes.
Formerly known as.
Yes, Memes. And he's the CEO of WON, W-O-N Worldwide. And also Deja Thomas, Program Manager for Care at Work in the UCLA Labor Center. So I will now turn to you and ask you to address more about what you're doing, what you are thinking about, and more of what you're doing research on. And I'll ask Dr. Brewer to start. Tim.
Tim, right? Tim works well. Well, thank you very much, Susan and Melissa and the organizers. I'm really looking forward to hearing what my colleagues say and be part of this panel. So I both take care of patients and I do research on the prevention and control of infectious diseases at the population level. I've been doing that for about 3 decades. Had the pleasure of advising and working with such organizations as the World Health Organization, NIH, the National Institute of Health Research for the UK, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, CDC, among others. It's been a busy 2 years for me. So I've spent too much time in intensive care units, and I have spent a lot of time advising organizations, including universities, about how do you cope with a pandemic. A lot of people don't realize this is probably the 3rd or 4th pandemic they've been through. So we had a influenza pandemic in 1957. We had another one in 1968. We had another one in 2009. And now we have a coronavirus pandemic in 2019, 2020, and then the HIV pandemic, which was first described actually here at UCLA in 1981. So what I've been focusing on the research side has been, and I'm happy to talk about the patient care side too, but on the research side, really how do we protect marginalized and displaced populations both here in the United States and globally. So one study colleagues and I did, actually colleagues at the education school, is we actually looked at a representative sample of school policies around students with disability and how they were trying to meet the needs of students with disabilities during the pandemic. And good news, bad news. The good news is some districts actually do it very well. Bad news is some districts don't do it at all. And one of the things we learned from that is that there are really opportunities to be able to figure out how to have impact and address the needs of this very vulnerable and important population here in the United States. Another study that we did is we actually took survey data from about 3.5 million people across all 54 countries in Africa. And what we wanted to understand is, did they have the resources to do what we call non-pharmacologic interventions to protect themselves? Can you wash your hands? Can you socially distance from someone? If you have to go home and isolate, can you actually do that? To isolate at home means you have to have a refrigerator. You have to have someplace to store food. You have to be able to go to the bathroom in your house. You have to have running water. And what we found out is there are hundreds of millions of people across these 54 countries that don't have the resources to do the very things that we tell everyone in high-income countries to do every day to protect themselves from COVID-19. And just stresses the importance of recognizing this as a global pandemic, and we really need to get those resources, including vaccines, everywhere around the world. So I'll stop there, and I'm delighted to have a conversation with you and my colleagues, and really looking forward to the rest of the evening.
Thanks, Tim. Bridget, you want to go next?
Sure. So my name is Bridget Callaghan, and I'm an assistant professor of psychology here at UCLA. In my lab, I guess together with my students and some of my collaborators, we really look at how early life experiences with the caregiver influence children's development. And so typically what I had done in my lab in the past is work with groups of children who've experienced some form of caregiving adversity, like a serious medical illness, or children who've been institutionalized or put in an orphanage and then adopted into American families. And also children who have been in the foster care system here in the United States and who have subsequently been adopted or reached some sort of stable caregiving arrangement. But we thought it really important during the pandemic to kind of expand out and to use our expertise in trauma and family systems to try and understand how this pandemic was affecting the family unit. So we launched a study in April 2020, so right around the start of the pandemic, asking parents and children to report on how things were going during lockdown. And we found kind of three primary things. One of the first things we found is that the context in which parents communicate with their children really seemed to impact what children were taking away from this event. So specifically, we found that parents who were more anxious about COVID-19 tended to communicate more threatening information to their children about COVID-19, and their children subsequently had more anxiety themselves about COVID-19. This fits with a really wide body of literature on parental buffering and parental amplification of children's fears that we already knew about, so saw again in this different context. Another thing we found in this pandemic is that the words that parents were using with their children also seem to have a really large impact on their children's functioning and behaviour. So specifically, the first person or plural pronoun use that parents used when describing the impact of the pandemic on them and their family seemed to interact with their own anxiety levels to influence children's fear. So for example, we found that within a highly anxious parent population, parents who used more we language, so we're not coping well, we're really not doing well in this situation, they tended to have children who were also feeling really anxious. And in contrast, parents who tended to focus more on the I, so I'm not doing well, I'm not coping, this is really tough for me, they tended to have children who were relatively lower in anxiety. And the opposite was true for parents who were lower in anxiety. So lower anxiety parents using we language, that tended to benefit their children. So the words that parents use, the context in which they communicate with their children, not surprisingly, really seem to impact what children were taking away from this event, and particularly what parents were feeling seemed to be amplified and brought to their children as well. To leave it on a positive note, one of the other things we did in this study was to ask parents and children as well to write for 5 minutes just openly about how the pandemic was affecting them. And it was really interesting to see the diversity even within an individual of both positive and negative themes that were coming up. So yes, it seemed to be a net negative. So no one was saying, yes, I'm super glad that this pandemic has happened, but nonetheless, surprisingly, but nonetheless, each person seemed to be able to draw out some positives from the event. So for example, many parents were saying, yes, I'm really worried about my health and the health of my family, and particularly my elderly parents. And I'm worried about my children's social development, but at the same time, I'm really thankful for this opportunity to spend more time with my family, to engage in less structured activities. In the words of one mother, she said that she was learning how to just be with her children, which is, I think, really important. Similarly with children, no child said that they were loving the pandemic, but they also did tend to have some positives. So many children reported having less schedule was something that they really enjoyed, so being less scheduled, and also having the opportunity to spend more time with their siblings, if you can believe that. So I think, to take away from this is part of the topic of the conversation tonight is moving forward from the pandemic. And I think there are lessons that we've all learned during this time that we can really reflect on in moving forward into this post-pandemic life. So happy to talk about that too, and really happy to be here and learn from everyone.
Thank you, Bridget.
Yeah.
Anna Marie.
Yeah, so much of what you said resonates with me as an educator. My name is Anna Marie Francois. I want to echo Timothy's gratitude for having me here today. It's such an important topic. I am a teacher educator in the School of Education and Information Studies. I've been here since 1999. And prior to that, I was an elementary school teacher and administrator. My father was a teacher for 38 years at Manual Arts High School and the juvenile justice system. So you could say that both UCLA and teaching runs through my veins. At UCLA, in the School of Education and Information Studies, I also lead a professional learning center, research center for K-12 educators, specifically teachers and school site leaders. So we have been doing a lot of work over the last 30 years on how to address the instructional needs of young people through high quality, equity-centered teaching and leading. And we do this work through preparation programs, but also through professional development and through coaching and working very closely with families in how they can engage with schools in meaningful ways. So we don't want families going into schools cutting paper. We want families to go into schools with all of the knowledge and assets that they have, that we can help teachers to leverage that information for higher student achievement and a greater sense of belonging for young people. So as you can imagine, well, you don't have to imagine, because you just need to turn on the news. Every day there's some news about how the pandemic has influenced the teaching and learning environments, particularly in our most marginalized communities, where our most vulnerable young people spend the majority of their time. And it is the adults at those schools that are creating the environments wherein either these young people thrive or these young people don't get served. And so we've spent a lot of time in the beginning of the pandemic shifting into more online supports for teachers, whether it was coaching, whether it was professional development. Because one of the things we know in our world is that time for collaboration and time for connection among teachers and among school site leaders gives them the energy, the strength, and that sense of, I can do this, that they can't do on their own. So we spent a lot of time transitioning into the online environment. We also spent a lot of time helping schools to turn their programming, their regular instructional activity, into online programming and going into virtual classrooms and supporting new and seasoned teachers to do that. Because I don't think that it's a best kept secret that prior to the pandemic, schools in general were not using technology well. And we asked teachers and leaders to pivot very quickly, in some cases within 24 hours, and put everything online. Now, I don't know about y'all, but if you asked me to do that, we would have a problem, okay? But we asked teachers to do that even as they were struggling to care for their own families, even as they didn't have the equipment at home to do that. And so our center provided those kinds of supports for them, both for teachers and for leaders. As I think about, and I won't go through all of the challenges because I think we're all well versed in the challenges for K-12 students. High among them is the level of trauma that they are experiencing and how they react to that trauma. And if you think about our most vulnerable students anyway, pre-pandemic, imagine what the pandemic has done to them. Imagine what young people come into classrooms with, having lost family members. We know many families who have lost both of their parents. Young people who have found themselves in foster care, young families who have found, young people who have found themselves homeless. And you see those stories on the news. What we forget oftentimes is they still come to school, hopefully, or they're still online, and who are the people that handle that? Who puts their arms around them and says, it's gonna be okay, and I'm gonna care for the whole child, not just what's up here. It's educators, it's teachers and school site leaders. The other thing that we're noticing about K-12 students is, while we would assume that there's this urgency to be reconnected, young people are struggling in schools to connect with one another. They want to be with their friends, but connection and belonging is very different than just being with others. So we're trying to help teachers figure out, how do we put the canon of education aside for a moment and create spaces of learning that are much more humane and bring folks into connection and belonging in meaningful ways, knowing that once we do that, then we can tackle the academics of schooling. We also think about some of the challenges that teachers and leaders face responding to ever-changing, unpredictable guidelines, again, in a moment's notice. And what we're finding is educators need the same kind of supports that they are providing for teachers. So we provide what we call communities of practice and communities of belonging, where we bring educators together so that they can share their stories, they can share their history, they can be a well of strength and support from one another. And most importantly, they can talk about successful strategies that they can take back to their school, because schools are not closing. The other thing that is challenging for teachers and leaders is, before you knew who was coming every day to school, most kids come to school every single day. Now you don't know who's showing up every day into your classroom. And it could be different kids on different days. Parents are making choices about whether to send their kids to school or not, and there's no advance notice. My own nephew has missed school probably 2 or 3 times a week because the word he uses is heavy. He's in the 4th grade. He should not be using words like it's heavy, you know? And fortunately for him, he has parents at home and aunts and uncles and grandparents that can help him with his educational responsibilities. But most of the kids that we work with don't. So, you know, we are working with parents to help them to navigate what it means to be a teacher with your student and maintain your parenting, you know, role. And they are very different. And then there's a whole host of challenges around teacher pipeline. Folks didn't want to become public school teachers anyway. The pay is low, the conditions aren't that great, and the reward is in here, right? When you're dealing with the trauma that we're dealing with post-COVID, the shortages, particularly in high needs areas like science, math, bilingual education, which for California is critical, we're having a hard time bringing teachers into the pipeline, let alone keeping the teachers that are already there. The bright spot to that, though, is that this generation of young people, and I think this is a result of COVID and the racial pandemic that was kind of simultaneously happening at the same time, is this generation is starting to see their own humanity and the humanity of others, and they want to provide service. And they see teaching as service. They see the principalship as service. And they're going into it with a different kind of disposition that is really grounded in the connectedness and humanity, even as they are experts in their field. And so I think that schooling is going to look very, very different. I'm hopeful about schooling because these young people are going to show us how to do schooling, not as a technical endeavor, but as something that draws out the goodness and the humanity in each of us, and then will allow us to become more skilled, knowledgeable, and caring citizens. I often say that what happens in schools happens in society. It's schools that create and maintain the democracy that we care about. I believe that this next generation, when we come out on the other side, we're going to find out that schools can be much more caring, democratic spaces of teaching and learning. I've got so much more to say, but I'll wait for questioning. And I know, you know, I said to myself,
that's a real
5
positive.
minutes. No, they don't. No, your turn.
Okay. Well, nice to hear that positive note. Eric.
Well, thank you all for having me and letting me be a part of this panel. My goal for the evening is to not have you asking why was he part of this panel by the time this panel is over. I realize because the importance of what I am worried about and focus on pales in comparison to my colleagues here. I guess I'm the sorbet or the palate cleanser of the panel. I worry about how you're entertained and how that is changing itself as a result of what's happened with the pandemic. So. Name's Eric Johnson. I've been in the sports, media, entertainment, music industry for 30 plus years. 20 of those years was at ESPN. on the West Coast and on the East Coast, and essentially overseeing all of their revenue generation, distribution, sports rights, some of the marketing as well, things of that function. And became a board member at the Center for Media, Entertainment, and Sports back in 2015, and started teaching with the idea and the ask from now Assistant Dean Sanjay Sood of creating a class that would teach students more directly what it's going to be like when they're in the workforce. You know, his request to me was, I want a class that has them prepared to where you would want to hire them and they could start right away, you know, within a 10-week window, which was pretty aggressive. And but I took it to heart, and certainly have tried to teach in a way that forces behaviors in the classroom to match more akin to what they're doing in the actual business world, which is forcing them to present more, which is during the Zoom, and students were complaining about Zoom, I'm saying business is being run that way right now, and so it's not terrible for you to figure out how to get your voice heard and display leadership and build connection with the people who you're going to be asking for promotions through a screen, because that is the way that we're doing it. And so we've built out something there. When I left ESPN, I started my own company, One Worldwide, and now I'm focused on all facets, music concerts to connecting esport with the student journey, gaming, for those who may like it or may not like it, a highly sophisticated community that has no representation at the middle school, high school, or college level is not being connected with education, with STEM programs and STEAM programs the way it should. We're creating inter-school competition nationally that is making those student athletes have empowerment and engagement in a way that athletes, quite frankly, traditional stick and ball athletes, are getting. That the retention and recruitment of gamers has been relatively low, yet in many ways they have the highest GPAs in comparison to that, and I think that's something that's passionate for me. But I'm dealing with that to NIL and what's the impact of NIL on the athletes and the schools and that educational process through that music concerts to acquisitions of properties within sports. So this is what my passion is. What we do with the center is very much focused on not only two industries, entertainment and sports industries, that were already ripe for change, but how that change accelerated with everybody being stuck at home and their consumption having to be radically altered, their lives radically altered. And it forced complete upheaval on these industries and how they generated business, thought about new productions, thought about how to create in-person versus streaming versus box office versus, and these are all things they had to struggle with. They probably were happening anyway. It took a 10-year process and reduced it down to 18 months. And so what's fascinating, what we're still trying to study is how much of that is good, how much of it is bad, and we can talk about some more of those things. I would argue that because box office is down, has changed the business. It does not mean that the business is broken, and it does not mean that it hasn't created a wealth of new opportunities that are positive. But the culture, the side of culture and of society, and things, tenets that run through just the psychology of communities has a massive impact. Sometimes influenced by entertainment, and sometimes entertainment reflects what's already happening, which we can get into.
Thank you. Just a whole different part of thinking about
I am definitely
the future. Yeah, and you were training people to do streaming, and then all of a sudden, that's all we were doing. Not just streaming, but yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Deja.
Yes, well, it is a lot to go after this wonderful panel. I will do my best. Thank you again, and echoing the thanks to bring this together and have these really good conversations with mix of perspective and expertise, and where I bring to this conversation. So I'm Deja Thomas. I'm the program manager at the Center for Advancement of Racial Equity at Work, and we are housed within the UCLA Labor Center. And so all our work, what we do, what we focus on is how do we center and focus on, and with the movement of labor work, economic justice, racial justice, immigrant justice, by bringing together workers, community organizations, unions, policymakers, this rigorous academic institution, alongside all of the students and the student workers. Ultimately, that's what most of the students at this campus are. So how do we bring all those people together, from union to worker centers, everyone in between, to really think about how do we build a California that is actually allows all workers to thrive and allows all workers to have family sustaining wages and to be able to isolate, to be able to take the time off work to take care of their families, to be able to take care of their nephew or their son when they need to have time off of school. How do you create that world? And so the Labor Center really focuses on, and our superpower in that way is being a nexus in this amazing institution to pull in all of the labor leaders, the union members, the worker centers, the community-based organizations, and to pull that in with the policymakers, the labor agencies, the elected officials, the workforce development boards, who actually have the ability to make those changes. And how do we bring those folks together in a way where workers low-wage workers, immigrant workers, workers of color, women in particular, and in all of those intersections, what they're able to voice and explain what their needs are as workers, and then on the other end of that, what are the solutions that they need? And one of the amazing things that we find, whether it's a study on nail care and nail salon workers, domestic workers, home care workers, Black workers, student workers, the workers always know what the problem is and what the solution is. They may not always have the exact technical language to know that that's Department of Labor or that's the Labor Secretary's job to do that, but they know exactly what needs to happen. So our role is to center that, amplify that, and get it in a position and in a way to where the folks who can make that change are able to do so with those workers centered. And so specifically in that work at Care at Work, which is a shortened term for my particular center, we do that work and we really focus on doing that work for Black workers and being an anchor institution and hub to anchor the larger field of Black worker power and organizing in Southern California. My project director, Lola Smallwood Cuevas, she actually has been at the Labor Center for over almost 20 years, I believe. From there, actually started the LA Black Worker Center, which was the first Black Worker Center in the country. And now there are, I think, over 15 Black Worker Centers and a National Black Worker Center. And so really the Labor Center is this space and place where we can incubate and experiment with workers, with policymakers, with labor folks to figure out what are the solutions that work. We also have a Dream Resource Center that really also focuses on undocumented workers and those students as well. And so that's the big picture. That's where we were. That's what we've always been doing. And then came along March 2020, and a lot of the studies and the work and all the workers I just mentioned and the sectors I just mentioned, we went into a lot of rapid response research. We went into a lot of research to say, what is actually happening with these workers? Are these workers being protected? Are all of the many worker rights that became enacted to keep workers safe, are they being followed? For all the workers who ended up getting furloughed or let go in that place, how are they coping in this reality? And so that was a lot of the work over the last 2 years, is both rapid response and long-term studies, going back to some of the existing organizations that we've already worked with. And I think that's really where our existing partnerships, and it not being one-off projects, but long-term relationships with, whether it's the domestic workers or the Black Worker Center, or student workers or fast food workers, those long-term partnerships with those worker centers and unions allowed us to really actively and proactively do research to support what they're trying to address and how they're trying to help their members and folks. And so really what we saw, particularly what I want to call out, is I really appreciated what all the panelists shared, because I think in our world, in our society, we all work, whether you work, your partner works, someone in your household works. And so what we saw was all of those things and how work, in some ways, for some workers that we talked to, how their workplace, their job actually allowed them to cope and survive this moment, and in some ways how their workplace actually prevented them from being able to take care of themselves. In our most recent study, Essential Stories, which is the largest survey of Black workers in SoCal, we found that Black women, over 90% of Black women had an increase in at-home responsibilities, whether it was financial or schooling or having to take care of their family members or themselves. But almost none of them said that their work was actually flexible to deal with that, even though there are laws in place where you're supposed to get time off if you're sick or for your family member. We found that like the nail salon workers, they also had issues with childcare as well, and majority of them being let go, both owners and workers. The story goes on and on. Fast food workers, which majority of those survey respondents were immigrant women of color. And they also had similar issues. A lot of them actually ended up contracting COVID on the job, or at least, suspected to be on the job because that's really their only exposure. And the same thing we found in other places. So really thinking about like when we talk about how do we get out of this pandemic and how do we move forward, I think the good and the bad and the ugly of the pandemic is that it really shined a light on the good, bad, and ugly, and how we live as a society and how we do or do not take care of each other and take care of the folks who we've deemed now as like essential to the point when we were told to stay home for our own safety, that they still left their home to make sure we were all taken care of. And how, as we are moving forward, instead of returning to that exact moment where a lot of those sectors, be it Amazon workers, be it nail salon domestic workers, educators, were ignored and not necessarily taken care of, how do we, when we move forward, how are we restructuring ourselves? How are we using this as a moment to actually build up our work? And so the Labor Center, we do that through all of this partnership work that I mentioned, and we are super excited to be here in this space, to collaborate with folks in that space, and we're hoping that folks join us in that work. There's a lot more I could share around that piece, but I will close it off there so we can get into other pieces.
Thank you. So I have questions for every single person, but I'm going to first ask the audience if you have questions. And while you're thinking about it, we have a couple questions that came in early from our Zoom viewers, and so I'll ask one of them. And it addresses how many lives have changed and may permanently change. And we've heard this. I mean, when Anna Maria was talking about, well, how do you count attendance? Well, the school districts are paid per attendance, and if they can't keep track of who's coming, then how does, anyway, so this question is it a new normal to be okay with not joining group activities? Who would like to comment, or all of you? In your profession, or the people that you study, or your patients?
I'll jump in.
Okay, Bridget, great, thank you.
I was thinking, this sounds like a psychologist question.
Everything's a psychology question. I mean, I think it is. I think the new normal is flexibility. And I think, we've heard that with, Deja just talking about the ongoing issues with the labor workforce, and certainly with education, and really every field, every person has been affected. And, my research has also shown that people have been affected in a wide variety of ways. So I think, being flexible, allowing people the space to feel uncomfortable, feel comfortable with things, to adjust slowly. It is an adjustment to go back to some sort of normal. So it's an important thing to be flexible during this time. So yes, I would say it's absolutely
It's the new normal.
Yeah, it's the new normal.
And Tim, did you want to comment? I see you nodding, or you were just nodding.
I would agree. The way I would think about it is think about it like 9/11, right? So unless you have TSA pre, you still have to take your shoes off every time you go to the airport, right? And that's not going to change. The plastic barriers between you and the cashiers are never going to go away, okay? Imagine what would have happened if you walked into a bank wearing a mask 3 years ago, right? But you can do that now, and that's not going to go away, right? So And sadly, the virus is not going to go away, right? This virus is incredibly well adapted for human-to-human transmission. Asymptomatic people can spread it. It is spread by respiratory droplets. That combination is the most difficult combination to control from an infection control point of view, from what I do. That's exactly what you don't want. You don't want people who have no symptoms, who people feel perfectly fine, are capable of spreading a disease to others. And they don't have to touch them, okay? So that's the worst place scenario. The last thing you need to remember is viruses do not think. They have no political agenda, okay? So when we put our agendas and our values and our opinions on this virus, doesn't matter. The conditions either exist for the virus to be able to replicate or they don't. And as far as the virus is concerned, that's the only thing that matters.
So now that you're talking about this, there's a recent news piece of a jury or a judge who has ruled that the Department of Public Health ruling does not have to be paid attention to. And it concerns me as to what are going to be the ramifications of that for other issues or other viruses or whatever. So I wondered if you wanted to comment on that recent court case.
Sure. So I think fundamentally what that shows you is our system is broken. That's what it tells you, right? When you have federal judges making public health policy, then that, and I'd really love to hear what my colleagues think, then that fundamental trust between people and institutions has broken down. That's what we're dealing with, right? You don't want people like me making law. You don't want federal judges making public health policy. But I'd really love to know what the others think.
It's an interesting question for an educator, because in the history of this country, we have never stopped asking teachers and school site leaders to take on responsibilities they have no business taking on. So a colleague and I were talking today about, how the narrative is, if you're a teacher, you're a coach, you're a counselor, you're a psychologist, you're everything. And now we're public health professionals. No, we're not public health professionals. And so I'm kind of still stuck on this question about social interaction. From a schooling perspective, I want the Timothys of the world to talk to our faculty and our staff in schools, and then let the teachers and the school leaders translate that into what do we actually do at this school based on the best of what what the other folks know. And oftentimes what happens in schooling is that someone else is making policy and they don't know what it's like to live at a school with young people who are developmentally different. And we are sometimes creating policies and practices in schools that are developmentally inappropriate,
Yes.
that instill fear in young people unnecessarily. And worse than that, the expectation that we continue to go on as normal. Young people in schools, I don't care if they're in preschool or in the 12th grade, they know that we are not in normal time. And so let's not pretend that we are. Let's get innovative and creative and identify the opportunities that are out there for us to create personalized learning. We create developmentally appropriate, not one-size-fits-all, differentiated learning, which is what we've been saying we're going to do since I've been a teacher, since my dad's been a teacher. Now, we must actually take that charge on in a very serious and intentional way. So when I said earlier, I'm hopeful out of these ashes, I think there springs hope and creativity. My mom used to always say, necessity is the mother of invention. She didn't create that, I'm sure you know that from, and I do think that we're in a necessary place where we're gonna need to draw upon, I love how you say co-construct solution from different sectors, because they all come to bear at a school site. And when I say a school site, it doesn't have to be a physical place, right? It can be a virtual place. We learned that in the last 2 years. So I have to say that.
I just wanted to add a quick
Comment,
thing.
please, Daisha.
Yeah, just around trust, just because we see it, this is ongoing research that we're in the middle of, but the idea that as a worker, the way that like a lot of the enforcement and accountability measures that as a labor center we've helped support and write and figure out how those things worked, they require the worker to have a level of trust in the system. So with our work on wage theft and really defining what that term is and creating an Office of Wage Standards, workers have to file a claim. Workers have to believe that when they file a claim, something will happen that will make them whole as a worker and that will prevent it from happening to other workers. Same thing with any other worker-related claim. But I think one thing that when you're in that agency who deals with that, or a court case or whatever it is, as a worker, I'm not distinguishing between that court case and the public health department and the labor agency and the school district. So what we see is when we're talking to folks and workers in that process, if they don't trust one piece of the whatever governmental agency that is supposed to support them that didn't, or that there was conflicting messaging, that translates into everything else and really makes our efforts on other ends much more harder to do, because we can't engage with folks if they don't trust that this process will work and actually work for them and make them whole and is there to support them if it's not there across other places. So I think the impacts of not just COVID, but just in general, is like the impacts of that go far beyond what that individual case is. And even seeing like in some of the outreach work we were supporting around COVID, workplace outreach project through the Labor and Workforce Development Agency, there were workers, Black workers, immigrant workers, women of color workers who had never heard of that agency, didn't know they existed, didn't know anything. But the moment they started to build that trust, not with the agency, but with the community-based organizations working on that agency's behalf, that's when they started to be like, okay, maybe if I do file a claim, something will happen. Or if I do this, my workplace will become safer. But I think that issue of trust across the board is so crucial and so delicate, because it can be easily taken away if another thing gets in the way of that.
Thank you.
I think the question that you were asking from someone
From the
virtually
Zoom audience, right.
was, is it the new norm to be able to not participate?
To not join because you
not
used to
join.
before and now you don't because.
As it relates to the business industry and the industries that I'm in, and connecting that back to the question that Tim asked, I don't know, the new norm is what the new current norm is the way I'd answer it. We don't know if this is indicative to how the norm will be 5 years from now or 10 years from now. You could also argue that technology has changed what norm is, right? It's normal that I went to Starbucks on my way here and got a coffee. What wasn't normal is I used my mobile app. There was no straw that was available to be able to drink it with, because those things have now changed. But I'm still just getting a coffee. I'm still consuming product at home. I'm doing it very differently. What's happened in the business world is you certainly have seen people drop out of the workforce and have made that conscious decision, probably very indicative of every one of us has taken a 2-week vacation, had clarity after 2 weeks of vacation, started creatively thinking about new things that we should probably be doing with our lives, and then got back to work and got back in the grind, and 3 weeks later forgot that we even had a vacation. Well, we just had 18 months of that. And that's given even more opportunity to create new habit. And I think there is a mistrust with corporation as my identification for who I am as a worker or as my contribution to society. And I do think that will be more sustainable. And I think the greatest pushback on that is that even for those who kept their jobs, in the entertainment industry, the marketing, media, and advertising industry, it's completely subjective to the employee whether they want to go into work. Every single company, every single client that I work with has a policy that says, we encourage you to come to work, but you don't have to. You don't have to come to work. We'd love to you in the office. We're paying a lot of money for that. You don't have to. This is what is happening right now, and the labor force is choosing to not go into work because they're seeing the inefficiencies of what the norm was that 4 hours of commuting to get to an office space to sit in a meeting was considered efficient use of time. You know, when we argued to have mothers be able to work at home on Fridays as a manager, and that was very difficult to get done by corporations, now we've had 2 years of we got everything done at home. That's not even a conversation anymore. So we have yet to find out whether that's going to be the new norm and what that pushback is, and whether 4-day work week comes or doesn't come, or what technology allows us to be able to. Maybe it's not quite as great, maybe it's better, but it's certainly not stopping business from happening.
Thank you. Question from the audience. Do I see a hand? We have people with a microphone. Yes, in the back. Julie, is that Julie? Yeah, great.
Thank you so much. Whenever I have a microphone, I always want to sing, but I'll spare you that. I have 2 questions, and I think they're related, Susan. One is I had a retreat, hybrid retreat, before everybody started coming back in this hybrid space, and opened up with talking about what's different, how are you going to show up? And immediately, where people across the board at all age levels, including students, went to, was this experience of this incredible sense of loss. In everybody's life was impacted in some way.
Mm-hmm.
So it's dealing with that, and just people being changed over the last 2 years, right?
Yeah.
And then my other question, and I was struck by this, Eric, when you started, because I don't think you're sorbet at all. I think a lot of what you do is about building community. And so how do we do that now? So that's my question, is dealing with that sense of loss, and then that sense of how do we do community now?
Well, can I
Please
answer
comment.
quickly?
Yes, yeah.
In the entertainment world, what has irrecoverably changed, which is terrific, is the number of new voices and the diversity of voices that have come out with content, and the ability for not everything to be pushed through one lens, which leads to greater connections, because we're all different. We're all coming from different places. We all have different priorities, experiences, and there's more ways to connect with more people that feel and think and love and vibe in the same way. So I think that has changed, and I think that has created that community. The fact that everyone had to go through something that was unprecedented in our lifetime to that degree, although I was worried about how many pandemics we've had, not thinking about it that way. There's shared, certainly shared experience that is being communicated through art. And even as benign as sports and how unimportant sports is, you know how important sports was after 9/11? You know, it was a healing mechanism.
Absolutely.
We wrestled with whether we were going to put sports back on because it didn't matter, but it did matter for different reasons. And I would say that I think a lot of the storytelling that has come out in the past 2 years, and you're going to continue to see that for the next few, has done just that.
I just think it's so important that we give ourselves permission to be in our full humanity right now. And everybody is at the precipice of that if they haven't already, just decided, this is who I am, this is what I'm feeling, this is how I see the world now. And if you have a problem with that, that's your problem. It's not mine. And at the center, we asked ourselves for 3 months before we opened the center back up, and we don't force people to come into work unless you're teaching, because the kids gotta have a teacher. And we kept asking ourselves, how do we come back? Who are we as we come back? Because we are not the same center. We changed the entire Center X office. We created a more communal office. The cubicles went down. Shared spaces came up. We repainted and got furniture that was vibrant. We brought the outside in so folks would feel we are coming back new, and it's okay to do that. And that you get to decide, right, where you feel comfortable, how you feel comfortable, and we will co-construct how our work will move forward together. And we open to the possibilities of that. And we had our first event 3 months ago, and it was outside. We didn't stay in the center. And it was not about business. There was no business on the agenda. It was about sharing our life stories, sharing artifacts of what have you learned about equity and about yourself over the last 2 years. And we spent about 2 hours together eating and talking about those things and just reconnecting. That sense of loss that you talked about, for me at least, quickly turned, because that's my tribe, that's my community. And so if we can just center that, and we all know we have jobs to do, we do those jobs well, but if we can lift up, embrace, and hold space for the humanity of one another, we will come out of this better.
Okay. Anyone else?
So think of
Yeah.
Gene Hackman in the Poseidon Adventure.
Love that movie.
The boat's going over, and Maureen McGovern's going, there's got to be a morning after, right? And, right, they're like, no, we're all dead. But, but they don't all die, right? Some of them actually make it up to the bottom of the boat, and they get out. Part of what I'm hearing is hope, right? And this is not the first pandemic. It is not the last pandemic. It's not even the worst pandemic as pandemics go, right? So a Yersinia pestis pandemic whipped through Europe, killed out 1/3 of the entire population, right? But humans are still here, and we're still going forward, and we're still mucking up our environments, and we're making relationships, and we're building things, and we're getting pissed off at each other, and we're generally having a good time at our sports events, right? So we will get through this, right? We will, and you just have to remember that. Yeah. You just have to, viruses are part of nature. Nature threw us a curveball. We got a little cocky, right? We thought we didn't have to care about nature anymore, and nature's like, yeah, you want to bet? You do that, right? Yeah. So, but we just get up and we keep on going, and we will get through this.
Hope is right. You're right. Julie, did you have a second question? Or Melissa, what? Okay, all right. So Melissa, Melissa's giving me hand signals, and I'm not sure. Do you have a question?
We have a couple questions from Zoom.
Great, okay.
So the first one is, how does one move forward if the loss of a loved one was a major shift in returning to normal?
Well, would that be a Bridget?
I'm glad she gets the hard one.
Yes.
I think it's down to flexibility and understanding again. It is not the only pandemic we've had, and it's not the only one that we're going to have, and it has changed us fundamentally. And I think what we need to take from that is to be flexible, to be adaptable, to be understanding, and to recognize one another's humanity, and to be unforgiving about our own humanity. So to be open about the way that this has affected us. So lots of us have not had someone who's died, maybe in this room. Plenty of us have not known someone who's died from COVID. Maybe some of us have. But lots of people talk about COVID every day in kind of a flippant way. So, some of the conversations we're having here are fun and lighthearted about COVID. But to remember that always, that's not been the case for many people. I think that's a really important thing to remember is, moving forward, this has not affected all of us in the same way. This has been an enormous tragedy for everyone on some level, but really fundamentally, the heartbreaking stories that you've shared with us tonight about some of the children in the school system, and I'm sure so many more. It's just unimaginable. So I think just being clear about how it's affected us and being unapologetic about that.
Asia?
Yeah, I just agree with everything you said. And one thing that I think about a lot with this too is how do we create space and structures that allows for people to deal with loss, that allows for flexibility for people to go through whatever they need to go through. Because like we said, it has changed all of us fundamentally, but I think people before COVID were going through loss. We just all weren't going through it at the same time. So how do we, like, obviously with my work in particular, we're thinking about like workspace and companies and jobs and public sector and all that good stuff. But like, how does your workspace create space for people to have those experiences, to go through loss? There's like this really sad but also funny meme around in this United States whenever people, you have your out of office email because you have an emergency, but it's like, I'm so sorry, I'll be on email, I'm at the hot, like, versus in other places, in other countries, if they're out of office, whether it's for an emergency or for their own personal reasons, that's it, it's respected. You don't have to like feel shame so how do you create space for that in your workplaces? How do you create space for that for low-wage workers, for underrepresented workers who maybe are in more precarious work positions to also have that as well?
So I have a question of all of you. You're all
Okay,
running.
so-
There's a question. Oh, Judith, go ahead. I won't forget mine.
I would have forgotten mine. When you talk about loss, I know friends who have lost people. We've lost about 10 to 12 friends and family members. And none of them to COVID, actually. But what I think the difference is that we weren't allowed to mourn.
Yep.
I lost a very dear uncle who was a big part of my life. Couldn't go to the funeral. Couldn't sit with the family. We sent flowers, we sent food, but it's not the same. And I don't know that even accepting and all of that takes care of it real quickly. I'm wondering the scars that will leave for a lot of people because it hasn't been able to be a shared experience.
That's 100% right. Yeah, absolutely.
This is all bringing back memories that when I was a little girl and the polio pandemic happened and the freaking things about that. And I hadn't thought about that in years. Aunts, uncles, cousins that suffered at least, if not death, a lifetime of limping or not being able to stand. And so it really, it's information. I hadn't thought about this in years. But when the pandemic came, then in this discussion, I go, yeah, this happens. Now we take it for granted that we all get polio shots and that we all have this and that and the other thing. But it is an interesting concept, I guess.
Yeah. Another question? Yeah.
I have a question that's kind of at the nexus of public health and trust, which both came up in these discussions. And one of the things, we have a small company, I was kind of the COVID coordinator for that. And there were times that I felt like I had to be a very unqualified translator, kind of to your point, of public health orders to our employees in such a way that would engender cooperation and understanding, and then a couple weeks later it would change, and a couple of months later it would change. And so I'm wondering if there's something there about lessons to be learned about communication around these issues or something. And I don't know who it's really to, all of you.
I think you have to start with Tim, don't you?
I think that he has.
Eric,
I
too.
think they
Eric,
both have
yeah.
something
Oh,
to
right,
say.
because there's now a certification program for being able to be a COVID test on filming site, right? But anyway,
So-
you go first, Tim, please. Then
So
Eric.
the first mistake we made is we allowed our fear to take control of our policy. Okay? So this was a coronavirus. This was not the first coronavirus outbreak we've had. So we had SARS in 2002, 2003, 8,000 cases, 800 deaths, 10% case fatality rate, 10 times higher than what we have with SARS-CoV-2. We had Middle East respiratory syndrome virus, which is still circulating, coronavirus, 34% mortality rate, 34 times higher. What those two viruses did not have was the ability to spread rapidly from person to person asymptomatically. Because we've been worried for the last 20 years about an influenza pandemic, every single country in the world just about had a pandemic preparedness plan in place. I've actually read the US plan, and they all threw it out the window. They all allowed fear to overdrive what they knew about public health, preparedness, and response to respiratory viruses. So if we take anything from this, it's how do we learn not to panic when we're afraid and say, okay, what do I know? What do I need to know? And what do I need to do?
So I'm just going to say quickly, I love that. Yeah, I'm going to tell my friend he's next in a minute. But I think that in this current socio-political environment, it's really difficult to identify what you know, what is truth, what is. There's so much to distill and so much to go through. I find myself getting fearful too, because I just don't know what to believe at this point. Yeah. So I just want to put that out.
Because we've lost that trust.
Yeah.
We've lost that trust.
Yes.
Eric, do you want to comment on that?
Well, one, I'm moved by even the idea that you recognized that as a question, something that we all have to deal with. And I think on the corporate side, the fact that the fear of being seen as not knowing what to do at the C-suite level is palpable, and empathy and curiosity at the C-suite level, being one, is sometimes a challenge. And in this situation, we had to model a behavior where the C-suite was allowed to not know what to do. And they empowered others to have to enact ways to combat this, who were empowered to say, I'm doing the best I can with the answers that I have, but not knowing what that's going to be. And I hope there's more of that, because I think that is how we lead with those things, to be able to understand and share. On the business side of what worked and what didn't work, I can use two examples of the way the NFL approached the fear and the way the NBA approached the fear during the pandemic. We're raging. There's going to be loss of billions and billions and billions of dollars. The NFL doesn't know how to play. They don't want to suspend play. The commissioner, as well as the owners, ultimately decide and decree, here's what we're going to do with the league. We're going to shut it down. Now we're going to start it up. Now we start it up. Now we have teams who can't play against each other because everyone keeps testing positive. So we're canceling games, but we want to make as much money as we can. So we're going to keep them going with zero regard for the Players Association or for the players. Dictated by 30+ owners and by a commissioner for revenue. And the players, obviously weren't a part of the process, but also didn't have any connection to the product either. There was nothing about that was positive. And it showed even in what their product was, is not that matters. The NBA, pragmatic, thought about it. Adam Silver, the commissioner there, worked directly with the Players Association. He talked to every one of the players to get the best idea of where are their common alliances that exist here. Not everyone's going to agree, but where is the commonality? Put it to a vote of, do you want to play or not want to play? You guys go in a room and you come back and tell us if you want to play. They did, and they created an environment in Orlando that was a bubble and said, well, all of your families will come here. We'll do it in Orlando because the Walt Disney Resort, I can bring all your families and you can all stay here. We'll get Disney to be able to have the staff so that we can all live here together, and I can control as much as we can possibly control. And the players were a part of that process. The players were heard. The play on the court is considered in the sports world to be some of the best play that's ever happened on the court, because they weren't distracted with travel, and they weren't distracted with, and they were fundamentally a part of that decision making. That's where some of those examples of where sport kind of modeled what every industry could have possibly gone through.
Yeah, I wonder when you're explaining that, I'm like, imagine if every workplace got together and said, how do we keep each other safe from COVID? Because that's very much like what legally they're supposed to, well, they're not even necessarily legally have to working with workers, but they have to have a plan. A lot of places don't have a plan. And I'm sure many of those who do didn't actually bring everyone together to figure out what that is. But imagine what this could have been like, and it can continue to be like if that was the case.
Okay. I have a question. And that is, all of you manage a center, a department, a unit. You all have a budget. You evaluate the progress toward reaching the goals. How can you do that when you're changing everything? You know, everybody's talking about the importance of equity and the importance of caring and everybody being involved and making decisions. But in the meantime, all those goals that you had before, they're out the window because you can't do them. And how is that going to be affected over time? Is everybody going to be operating at a loss?
I think for us in particular, I'll answer from like the Labor Center and particularly Care at Work is we always have that North Star. Like I said, that North Star around how do you build a California labor and workforce field and that allows every worker to have a thriving life, to be able to sustain their life, family sustaining wages, whether they're an immigrant worker, woman of color, person of color, Black, brown, and everything in between, low wage or not, whatever the education level is. And that North Star doesn't change. What the context and how and who the exact players are can change, you know, what the windows of opportunity has certainly changed of, you know, when we're in this moment and how we leverage things. But I think with that key North Star and the collaborative work that we do and will continue to do, that doesn't change. And I think that's what keeps it, even with all the things moving around, even with budgets moving around.
Okay, I see you all nodding.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer, and I really agree with that.
How you get there is going to change.
Yeah.
Goals have not changed at all.
Yeah, thanks. Melissa, I saw your hand. You had one more. You had another Zoom question?
Yeah, we have another question from Zoom, and it seems like, well, anyone can answer, but it seems a little bit more like it's for Anna Marie. Where are the students who did not come back to school this year? How do we give them and other underserved groups the skills they need? And actually, there was a second question by someone else, but it relates. And what things can we do to support teachers?
And this may be the last question.
Can you just repeat it?
Could you repeat it, Melissa?
I'm hard of hearing, so
I couldn't hear too well either.
Where are the students who did not come back to school this year? How can we give them and other underserved groups the skills that they need? And what specific things can we do to support teachers?
Oh, we could talk about that for a full 2 hours. I'll see you all next week, same time. So a lot of our students are still at home. They've gone to homeschooling situation. You know, one of the things that you said, Bridget, that really resonated with me is one of the beautiful things I think that has happened as a result of the pandemic is that parents, caregivers, and families and the relationship with schools have actually improved. And I think it's because there now is a sense of empathy. They are offering each other grace. They understand how hard this is, and they are joining forces together in the best interest of young people. In California, at least, a lot of families are leaving because of workforce issues related to COVID. I think that another good thing is that the state of California has made tremendous financial investments in K-12 schools. And so from anything from, you know, professional learning opportunities to collaboration opportunities, so there's a lot of money flowing in. What we don't have is people. So we got a lot of money and we can't hire anybody because nobody wants to go into teaching. It's a PR problem. Teachers are vulnerable. Can you imagine? I mean, we're talking about, we don't have the opportunity to stay at home. They've got to show up with young people where you don't know, you know, what their home situation is. And the older they get, older the students get, the more likely it is that they are outside and they're asymptomatic and they're coming into schools and whatnot. And the economic downturn for the most vulnerable communities as a result of the pandemic, who wants to come into that, you know, when the pay is so low? So I think what we can do is help find creative solutions for opening up the pipeline into teaching, creating programs that maybe are connected to community colleges, creating high school pipelines to community college and then into teaching. We got a whole labor force out there from the corporate world. I'm looking at you. Who in the pandemic has changed the way they've thought about how they want to live the rest of their life. They got a lot of knowledge and skills that could benefit young people in school. Become a teacher in your next life.
I happen to teach.
What I mean?
I happen to have left a large corporation I know of. I'm self-employed and I teach.
I thought you were a teacher.
I listen.
I thought you were a teacher, yeah. I thought you were a teacher at the Anderson School.
I teach at Anderson.
There we go.
I want you to teach high school.
I would love to do that.
You see that? This creative problem solving that's going on? I mean, you can support teachers and you can support school leaders by A, giving them grace, B, we take on a lot. We don't need more blame for what's going on in the world. We need support, we need love, we need folks to see us as human, just like we see the folks across the other side of the table as human beings. And I think we want to hear the voices of people who have knowledge and interest and power to help us figure this out, because we can't figure it out on our own. And no offense to my folks up in the policy world and in academia, but y'all haven't done it 100% correctly. We need to be in partnership to figure out the answers. We need your partnership.
And
Well said, yes. Wait, did I hear somebody say something else?
Oh, that was me.
Oh, okay, Deja, go ahead.
Hopping just one last second. No, and to that point, I think when you say that, I think a lot of like, how are you supporting teachers? How are you supporting, most teachers are unionized. How are you supporting teachers' unions? And then also the other thing around the Labor Center, we have a workforce development team that looks at how do you create those pipeline programs and pre-apprenticeship and apprenticeship pathways for students, for disadvantaged youth, for disconnected youth, for workers who are any number of reasons, Black workers, immigrants, et cetera, and how do you create that pipeline through high road training partnerships with the traditional union industries like ports and construction and those building trades, but also into new and emerging industries like they're doing work with cannabis workers, water utility districts, with nail salons. How do you create that pipeline that get students and get those students who may be lost, and how do you support the teachers to get those students back into that teaching pipeline, and then how do you make sure wherever they're going, they're actually supported, so we like can sell people on a dream that can actually be realized. So
Can I just add one thing to support teachers and school leaders?
Do I dare say no?
Can we stop talking about learning loss?
Yeah.
Yes,
Learning loss?
Learning loss. Yes, it is true that test scores have gone down, but kids have learned a lot during the pandemic. They have learned a lot. And I think we should value and honor the kind of learning that comes from facing challenges. Not ignoring that there's been loss, there's been challenges, but kids have learned a lot, and let's give them some credit for that. Let's give teachers some credit for that. And those test scores are going to go up. So let's stop talking about learning loss. Let's think about learning in a different way.
And let's all give a heartfelt thanks to you all. So to Tim Brewer, Bridget Halligan, right? Anna Marie Francois, Eric Johnson, and Deha Thomas, thank you so much for your expertise, your talent, your knowledge, and being open to answering the questions that have come. I want to thank the UCLA Women in Philanthropy members who are here with us and who are on Zoom. UCLA supports participation from all of us, and we welcome all members in helping plan events. We like to include the broadest and the most diverse participation from everybody. I also want to thank Andrea Piscitani and the development events team for helping with all of the Zoom meeting logistics. And finally, great appreciation, to the staff, Melissa Efron-Hayek and our program manager, Betty Montano. May we all continue to enjoy being on the UCLA campus again and again, and we'll all come back often, right? Good night.